Hello, welcome. Thank you all for coming to this event. My name is Chris Phelan. I'm the chair of the economics department. That has many duties which I don't enjoy, but one of the duties is getting to introduce people like Richard Sandor, which I greatly enjoy. First, I want to say just a few words about the Heller-Hurwitz Economics Institute. The Heller-Hurwitz Economics Institute is meant to be a bridge between kind of the personalities of Hurwitz and Heller. The personalities are the public policy side of economics, which was represented by Walter Heller, and the thinking about theoretical issues which deeply affect public policy, which was represented by Leo Hurwitz. The department is deeply proud of both, deeply proud of our legacy associated with both, and we believe that the Heller-Hurwitz Institute is a way of continuing that legacy. So in that vein is this conference and this speaker. Richard Sandor is the CEO of Environmental Financial Products and the Aaron Director Lecturer in Law of Economics at the University of Chicago Law School. That's a great, being named after Aaron Director is having a chair for Aaron Director is a great honor. He's perhaps best known as the father of financial futures for his pioneering work in developing the first interest rate futures contract in the 1970s. He's the founder of the Chicago Climate Exchange, the first exchange to facilitate the reduction of all 6 greenhouse gases. In 2013, he was named a knight in the French National Order of the Legion of Honor. He's the author of Good Derivatives, A Story of Financial and Environmental Innovation, and most recently, Sustainable Investing in Environmental Markets, Opportunities in a New Asset Class. This is a wonderfully accomplished man, but among the accomplishments that those of us like to believe is the most important is that he holds a Ph.D. from the University of Minnesota, from the Department of Economics.
Chris, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure, and having gone to graduate school here, I can only say that it has been an important pillar of whatever small success I have had. My lovely wife, Ellen, who was sitting in the first row, she and I settled into married life 51 years ago today, or this week, in Roseville, Minnesota. So I have a lot to be grateful to this department for providing me the funds to get married and stay married for 51 years and for having an incredible education and mentors, among them being Walter Heller and Leo Hurwitz, who have been fine in every regard than a teacher could be. So I owe a lot to the university, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I've been asked to talk about environmental market successes and challenges. And one of the big challenges that we face these days is the fact that the press and others have seemed to indicate that climate change is no problem whatsoever. This is an op-ed that appeared 4 or 5 days ago saying, don't worry about it, climate change doesn't count, it's irrelevant, and global warming is not an issue. Funny enough, 3 days later, the Financial Times talked about $20 to $50 billion of infrastructure that would have to be spent by New York and Mumbai and various cities as a result of sea level rises. I don't get it. And then shortly after that the Financial Times just on the 10th noted that carbon dioxide is surging. So we have all of these mixed messages. How does this happen? And I'm proud to say the University of Minnesota, in holding this program, and in particular to Chari and his colleagues, trying to address and deal with the fact that economists are over here talking about the economics, scientists are over here talking about the science, and there isn't unanimity of thought. And a conference like this becomes critical because it does speak to the issues about how economists and scientists can collaborate, rather than economists talking about physics and climate change and climate scientists talking about taxes and markets. I think there's a sensible division of labor here. And I'm glad to see it being encouraged. Part of the problem is not only scientists and economists, but a third one is basically politicians and the public. And they have to speak on an informed basis. When I was an undergraduate, I took classical Greek and Roman civilization, and I was privileged to read Aeschylus, who said, "Bad beginnings make for bad endings." So how did we get to the point where we have no federal policy in the United States? And it really occurred as a result of some commonplace difficulties. And the slide isn't up, so let me tell you what the slide would have said. That the first legislation proposed on climate change basically assumed that the rights to emit would be auctioned off and would raise $660 billion. And there was a confusion there about whether climate change was a revenue-raising idea or was it a tool to combat global warming. And as a result of the budget that was proposed in 2009, it turned out that the $660 billion, if you did the arithmetic, I'm sorry, David's not here, would have meant that the U.S. power sector would have had to pony up somewhere near a third of that, which would have consumed virtually the entire profits of the power sector. It just didn't make any common sense. The lightning bolt came down. Those people who didn't think there was reason to be concerned about catastrophic weather events said this is a tax. Climate change doesn't exist, and we're going to take $600 billion before compliance even begins. So we take all of the after-tax profit of utilities before they have to do any reductions, and that would be the first thing. So they have no capital to do any abatement. The result of carelessness and hostility on both sides by Democrats and Republicans resulted in a frozen policy. And in fact, we demonized cap and trade, a market-based system. So what is cap and trade? I'm charged to talk about markets and the successes and the challenges. So let's first start with the definition. Cap and trade arises out of an article by Ronald Coase on the theory of social costs, which I had to read in Leo Hurwitz's course in micro. And it talked about the ability for bargains to take place, which essentially was a trade. The theory is that you put a cap on emissions, lower than they have been, and the art of it is that you allow trading to occur between different entities. So let's assume there's Richard Power and there's Chari Electricity. And we both have to cut our emissions by 10%. But suppose Chari electricity is really good and can implement and switch from coal to gas, and he can cut it by more than 10%, and maybe 20 or 30. But suppose Richard Power is not good. It doesn't have the plant and equipment. I don't have the financial wherewithal. My budget is strapped. I'm over-leveraged. Then what I can do is essentially buy the excess reductions from Chari electricity and be in compliance and be hedged until I can implement a technology. This was considered very revolutionary, but it was passed into federal law in 1990. Before it was passed into law, the debates ravaged, and it's worthwhile talking a little bit about why they ravaged. They said, if you force utilities to cut emissions by 50 to 75%, power prices will go through the roof and the U.S. will not be able to compete internationally because most of our power is generated from coal. When coal is burned, sulfur is emitted. It goes into the atmosphere, combines with oxygen, water goes through it, and we get acid rain. In the 1980s, acid rain was a metaphor for everything that was wrong. Michael Douglas actually starred in a movie called Black Rain. You know, it was the end of times, okay? It was that serious. The other argument was the cost of cutting it would be prohibitive. That was 2. And 3, there would be brownouts that would wave in and out of the United States because no new power would be built and it would be possible to actually shut the lights off. Well, what happened? If you look at the left side of the thing, you'll take a look at concentrations of acid rain in the United States in 1990, and just look at it in 2009. It's essentially disappeared. The lights didn't go out. U.S. power is readily available, and utilities have been investing capital over the years. The emissions went from 18 million tons a year to roughly 3.5 million tons. We've had an 80% reduction in the amount of acid rain in the United States, virtually disappeared. How about the cost? Forecasters said $1,000 a ton to cut. 600, 300. The first trade was roughly in the $180 range. It ran up to $250. It got as low as $80 and never hit anywhere near, but for a brief moment in the last 20 years, above the forecast, at the highest forecasted level, and generally at a quarter. More importantly than that, in the United States today, the amount of reduction in medical expenses associated with lung disease from acid rain is $123 billion. If you go to the EPA website, annually we save $123 billion in health care expenditures. We save 30 to 40,000 lives. And the entire cost of the program at the highest estimated level is $3 billion on a $15 trillion economy. Do the arithmetic. It's real simple, it works, and basically it's gone unnoticed. And when you talk about acid rain today in front of young students at the University of Chicago, they say, what is that? And when did it exist? And Is that like Beijing is now? And if you take a look at the numbers, having done it, the Chinese produce 27 to 30 billion as opposed to 18 billion in our cap. They have a geographical size about the size of the United States, but they have 1.4 to 1.5 billion as opposed to 300 million. So if you extrapolate the numbers that I just gave you for the US, the Chinese could avoid in future liabilities 500 billion to 600 billion a year in medical expenses. And boy, are they studying this. And it won't surprise me to see them on this case. So while trading may not have the greatest reputation these days in the United States, it has a wonderful level of interest, cap and trade in China. Let me talk, if I can, a little bit about some of the successes and some of the challenges so we can get you out of here in 10 minutes and get to maybe some questions from the audience. We started something called the Chicago Climate Exchange in 2004. And we said that we thought we could get American companies without a law to join and to sign on to a legally binding commitment to reduce emissions. We eventually got 112 companies. It says the lighthouse because economists believe that nobody could ever build lighthouses for profit. And nobody thought because of free riding you could ever get an exchange to voluntarily reduce emissions because there would be free riding and nobody would do it. We built a company that was bigger than Germany with regard to emissions levels, all on a voluntary basis. And I'm here to tell you that among the leading members were the University of Minnesota and Cargill, both of whom were involved in that original experiment, and they contributed. And the University of Minnesota, if my numbers are right, and the previous chancellor said it, I think earned $750,000 by selling carbon permits on the exchange, which was further used for clean energy purposes on the campus. So it was monetized, it was tried, it was among 4 or 5 universities that did it, and I couldn't have been prouder of that particular moment. Well, where do we stand now in the next 7 or 8 minutes? We have a depressing state in Washington, D.C. You know, we have no action at the federal level. But I want to remind you of what one of the great Supreme Court justices said, that it's a happy accident of federalism that citizens, if they so choose in any given state, can experiment with public policy and not put the nations at risk. This sort of thinking has gone out of fashion, but I really think there's an opportunity here for the state of Minnesota and for the upper Midwest, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. If we take a look at cap and trade and carbon emissions, it's basically alive and well in California, which would be the 9th or 10th largest economy in the world. It's alive and well in RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is 9 states. So actually, cap and trade is thriving, except at the state level. It's alive in Brazil. It's prevalent in the UK. It's even, Australia is on again, off again, but Mozambique may be on again. And more importantly, there are 7 sort of regional exchanges in China, pilots. And I would suggest here that the future of federal policy will be linked to the new clean air proposal that just came out of the EPA, But I wouldn't be surprised for China and California to lead the pack. For good or bad, California is the home of change. Some good, some not so good. But there is a robust program for a major nation. Where's the opportunity? Look at Minnesota, the biggest 41% reduction that has to occur in Minnesota under the proposed EPA rules. 34%. North Dakota's 11%. How about a little trading between these two? Does this not make sense that there would be low-cost emitters, different targets? This is ripe. This is low-hanging fruit. It's very juicy and it's fat, and there's differences in marginal cost curves and objectives for all of these states. Trading makes sense. And Minnesota can and should be a leader in this. And I think this is a critical area. Let me conclude and talk, if I can, on 2 minutes and opportunities. What have I said? I basically shared with you there's a great deal of confusion out there. 2 leading worldwide newspapers, diametrically opposed editorial, carbon's a problem, carbon's not a problem. We don't need to worry about it. City's going to spend $20 billion, okay? This is a very difficult situation. We discussed earlier today, and a lot of participants talked about catastrophic occurrence. The problem of climate change isn't necessarily expected. It's the tails. It's Hurricane Sandy that turns right and hits New York and takes out $250 billion, which is not hard to imagine. The total capital in the insurance sector for that kind of is $500 billion. So one storm could wipe out insurance companies, and you could have an 07-08 crisis as a result of a climate-related event. It is the tails of the distribution, and we need to be cautious and think about that. So, having said that, it was cap and trade that worked. There's confusion that was caused by a budget number which scared everybody, and the left and the right were polarized, and nobody could come together. It has to be the academic world, the thought leaders at conferences like this, that can say, look, these are the potential catastrophic occurrences that could occur. Here's why a cost of this is warranted. And it's like buying insurance. And these were the kinds of comments that came out today. Let me conclude by giving you just some food for thought. I have children. We have children. We have grandchildren. I worry about the state of the world, okay? With 9, 11, 13, and 16-year-old grandkids, okay? It's disturbing. As bad as I'm worried about that, I'm more worried about water, which I think is the commodity of the 21st century. Okay? Tibet is not about religion, it's about water. Make no purposes of that. Okay? In the parlance of markets, we're long in North America, we're long in South America, we're long in Europe. Every other place in the world is short water. Africa is short, the Middle East is short, India is short, China is short. It is a common resource that has to be managed, and I think markets are the way to deal with it. And conflict resolution in water, if you don't do it with price, you'll do it with war, okay? And that's really frightening. So, to conclude, I'm ultimately optimistic. I'm really excited to see the scientists get together with the economists. I don't think the solutions are difficult. I think the political challenges are far larger than the intellectual differences among different professions. But I couldn't be prouder to come home after 51 years with my wife, Ellen, to be here and to really thank the University of Minnesota and its economics department for everything it's done for me. Thank you all very much.
I hope this works. This is meant mainly for questions from the audience. So I've known Richard for a number of years, and the singular characteristic that I would use to describe Richard is inveterate optimist. So when we talked about what he should talk about, he suggested that we talk about environmental markets, and I said that maybe we should talk about successes and challenges. As you saw from the presentation, for Richard, the challenges seem trivial, right? Yeah. But that's sort of has been his attitude all throughout his life. Challenges are there. We know we can overcome them, and we can get done with them. Having said that, let me kick it off by asking if the audience has any questions. Sherman.
Quick question.
It might actually help to identify yourself, just that others know.
My name is Sherman.
I have microphone.
There's a microphone right next to you.
Wow. Okay, I'm not used to a microphone, but my name is Sherman, and I'm a Minneapolis resident, of course. Heller Hurwitz, I love it. And I love asking questions. My question is this, very practical. I was out at Lake Tahoe last weekend, and beautiful place, wonderful. Reno, Lake Tahoe, Sacramento. They've had a drought now for 2.5 years. And we're all walking around. We're walking around, Lake Tahoe and stuff like that. Lake Tahoe's down about 4 feet. They haven't had any rain. Everything is dry, dry, dry. It's been 2.5 years. The ski areas, they haven't been getting any snow. And I say, what's going on out here? How long is this going to last? And they say, well, this is climate change. And of course, I just go, what? I mean, why is this? I mean, it's beautiful blue skies. The weather is perfect. You can't complain, but the water's down. Oh, and then a couple of guys from Reno, they said Reno just tapped into their 9-year water supply. Apparently, they have a reservoir that's going to last for 9 years, and they just tapped into it. And so all of us are wandering around out there, and we all talk about climate change. We're talking about California, Lake Tahoe, Reno, just that little area. It's had no rain, no snow, relatively, for the last 2.5 years. I'd appreciate your comments on climate change as far as that little tiny area is concerned.
I'd be happy to do. Before I do that, 2 things, because my wife said I should answer the questions that are implicit and not explicit. So the hat is an homage to my father, for which there's a Henry Sandor Fellowship in Environmental Economics, and I continue to honor him because he wore them. And the socks are from my grandson, who said, Grandpa, every time you make a speech that's important, would you wear these for good luck? So that's the hat. That's the unanswered question for you. The water issue is a real serious issue. And it is related to climate exchange, but it's also related to abuse of water supplies. So, for example, in the United States or in a city like Chicago, we use 150 to 175 gallons per capita a year, okay? In Albuquerque, they use about the same. One's a desert, the other is a city that's on the greatest body of fresh water in the world. The per capita need is 25 to 30 gallons, which is the consumption in China. In Europe, it's 75 gallons, and we're at 150. Every time you eat a 1-pound steak, you can consume 1,850 gallons of water, okay? 1,850 gallons for 1 pound of steak. A chicken is 600 to 700 gallons. a pound of wheat is 100 gallons. We don't price water because, as I said to somebody traveling in New Mexico, I said, how come there's so many golf courses, 64 here, it's the high desert? He said, water's free. That's why, you know, and we get into the same issues. So people take recreational showers, right, in the desert. You bathe not for hygiene and not for hydration, but you're spending 125 gallons a day, what's required in those two things. And that's been the story of California. All of this is you grow cotton in the Central Valley. You grow rice in the Central Valley. You grow cotton in Arizona. I don't get it. I'm like Tom Hanks in the movie Big, you know. What's going on here? I woke up as an adult. I was a 13-year-old yesterday, and they're building golf courses as if things were going out of style and water was thing. That's just the beginning of it. We did a study for a foundation in Chicago, and when I left Minnesota and I went to Berkeley, California to teach. And in that period, the population shifted from Northern California to Southern California as the Asian immigration, particularly the Koreans, at that time turned to political power. And what did they do? They built an aqueduct from Northern California to Southern California because they had the political power. We in the upper Midwest should understand if that political power shifts to the West Coast, these Great Lakes could easily be piped down to Texas. The cost is not that bad if you got the rights of way, and if you which we advocated but still doesn't exist, there is no metering of water in the Great Lakes. You can take as much as you want whenever, and we don't even keep track of it. Nobody knows what the basin level is sustainable or not, and we don't look at it. So that's the problem. It's overconsumption, inefficiencies in the use of water, geographical and basin require different markets. But we trade water now, but we don't call it water trading. We call it grain trading. Every time the United States exports a bushel of wheat, we're exporting, or a pound of wheat, we're exporting 100 gallons of water. And the grain trade is really a surrogate for water trading. We don't think of it, but it's virtual water trading. And once you stop doing it with food, there's going to be a real big issue. And so I do think this is something that we have to address. Long-winded answer, but I think it's a very important topic.
This question back there.
Thank you. My name's Paul Helgeson, and I think I'm the only person wearing a brown coat here. My question was about the EPA slide you had with Minnesota having a 40+% reduction and North Dakota only having 11% reduction. Yet North Dakota is experiencing a natural gas boom in the Balkan oil fields, and they're flaring off millions of BTUs of potential energy that could be used more effectively in the economy. Plus, there's unaccounted for fugitive emissions with the fracking process. So how do we know that a calculation for a cap and trade model has scientific integrity and reputational credibility?
I don't know is the answer, but the answer is that the EPA is taking comments. It's important that you weigh in and that other citizens weigh in. It hasn't been a process that's been vetted yet in full. And I think it's a goal of a conference like this, to be it every one of the scholars today should have an opinion on this. You know, maybe Bob Litterman can organize the same way that he organized or helped organize Heller Hurwitz. Everybody who's attending this conference should have a viewpoint on whether well, let's say lack of synchronicity with reductions are right and fair and transparently determined. And then maybe they are, maybe they don't. I don't know. I don't work in that area, but I wish that the academic field would focus on asking those questions.
For what it's worth, if I may just remark, one of the questions, there were several papers explicitly oriented towards thinking about policy kinds of issues. And one of the main messages that I at least got out of those papers is that in order to make these kinds of agreements, they were thinking about international kinds of agreements, but I think it applies just as much to North Dakota and Minnesota. North Dakota feels like a foreign country to many Minnesotans who haven't lived here long enough. It's right next door. But a lot of that discussion was about how these kinds of agreements are effective only if you have adequate, efficient monitoring systems to make sure that people are complying with those kinds of agreements. But that's a technical problem that I'm a chemical engineer from way back, so it's an easy problem. It's not like an economic problem, which is really hard. It's an engineering problem. Engineers can solve it.
Hi, my name's Claudia Egelhoff. I'm a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby, and I'd like to ask your opinion of a carbon tax as a method, a market-driven method for reducing greenhouse gas emissions versus the cap and trade system.
Obviously, I'm biased, so let me state up front that I naturally favor a market. I think one has to be very careful, particularly in this environment, in getting us thinking about the wrong things, because I think and now I'm stepping out of my role, is I kind of try to bridge the gap, Claudia, is it, between theory and practice. And I spent a lot of times lugging some very heavy legislation over the last 40 years, and I've worked on 4 bills. One is in '73, which established the CFTC, and then in the '80s, tax treatment of derivatives, and then in '90, the Clean Air Act, and most recently, Waxman-Markey, that bill. My reading of the political tea leaves, particularly as we talk about Walgreens and tax inversion and 7,000 pages of code and lobbying and K Street, and the average per capita income in Washington, D.C. is now higher than Silicon Valley. So I think that taxation is not an idea whose time has come, although as a solution to a social problem. Alternatively, I want to see it priced. Bob and I have talked about it. I think you need to price it. I don't think the political realities today will accommodate a taxation policy. They don't do it in communist China. They favor markets. You go in and you say to the People's Republic, I say, well, you could solve this by taxation. They said, no, we don't want to tax anybody. This is the People's Republic of China, okay? And the Central Party doesn't want taxes, it wants markets, okay? And so I'm a little bit informed by what the Central Party wants. And the mood in Washington, D.C., and I would say taxes, not today. We have more of a chance of getting a cap and trade program, as the president has done with this EPA administrative stuff. And I think that I watched this taxation kill cap and trade for the last 8 years. I think it's dangerous. I think it's bad. It allows the left and the right to go at each other like cats and dogs, as opposed to having a centrist philosophy. And so I would say I'd go very slowly in advocating taxation, because it throws the debate in the wrong place. Who's going to use the money? Where's it going to go to? Who's going to avoid taxation through lobbyists, and who's going to get an out, and so on and so forth. So that's a personal opinion. Having said that, we have to price pollutants.
Hi, Dr. Sandor. I'm Jeremy Kalin. I'm a recovering former legislator in Minnesota in the House here, and served when we adopted actually one of the first major bills. I was lucky enough to be a co-author and a champion of a key provision on it, was our Global Warming Mitigation Act. And then had the honor of working on behalf of the White House and the Senate with centrist Republicans and Democrats, working on the laboratory's democracy, including the author of AB 32 and other state-level innovation, trying to make that translation from abstract economic theory and non-temporal, removed from the causation of climate change, to sort of like, you got to act, and this is how you can act, and this is how it's safe for you to act, and this is why. The discussion is about political economies. So you prefaced your last response here by talking about that translation from abstract and academic to realities. I struggled as a legislator who gets it to even accept the 80% target reduction by 2050, because it is not tangible, it is not urgent like acid rain or other even the water challenges. Can you talk a little bit about ways to build that political capital and the role of academic economists in making that translation into something practical, that therefore we can get it, we can understand it, and translate it into political will? Because that's, in my mind, having been there, that's the challenge.
It was interesting today because we had a press conference, and this was the consensus, and it was Michael and a few others, Bob, were there, and a very distinguished group of academic economists. I brought the average IQ level down by being there, but it was really formidable people. And I think the answer that everybody said was education, and not the politicians, but the public, that it would be easier to influence the process. The battle's over once you hit the 5th grade in the United States. Those kids are all in. I mean, I've spoken at high schools, I've spoken at universities, and in the last book tour, and you go to Peking, Shanghai, you go to Fudan University, you go to Tsinghua, you go to Hong Kong Polytech, you go to Oxford, you go to Harvard, Yale, MIT, Brown, etc. Boy, you don't find an opposition, not one, among the young people. And you need to get to the high school kids, who I think in general need to be studying economics, as a sidebar. I went to a wedding in Chennai a year and a half ago, and one of my partners got married there, and one of the kids who was 12 years old came tugging over and said, "I heard you're an economist, and I'm in the 8th grade, and I'm studying credit cards and accounting and debiting and crediting, and my uncle said you're well known." And for a half hour, this kid was asking me about factors of production and things like this. And we're innumerate and economically illiterate. And I think we have to generally educate people in economics a lot earlier. We talk about literacy and illiteracy. We don't seem to talk about numeracy and innumeracy. We're beginning to talk about it because we're falling behind with STEM and things like that. But I think you need to get. a bunch of high schools to join the Chicago Friends in Washington, D.C., and a few others. And I think you need to get to the electorate, because the vested interests aren't going to allow it to come in, you know, for lots of reasons. You don't control votes, or you don't have enough money.
I think there's a question back there.
Bob Tamman from Sudan, Minnesota, up on the Iron Range. You mentioned the Chinese great devotion to markets, and I've been seeing reports for the last couple of years that the Chinese are stockpiling copper and iron ore, not necessarily for purposes of their consumption, but their system will allow them to create liquidity by using those stockpiles for loans. Apparently, they'll often take 2 or 3 loans on the same stockpile. My question is, they're not using these commodities necessarily for productive purposes, so are we going to commoditize water and allow the Chinese to tie up our water supply too? Thank you.
It's a great question. No, because when we speak about water trading, we talk about only water in excess of human needs. So we only talk about the excess amount of it, number one. Number two, because of transportation economics, you can't ship water effectively basin to basin. So you have to figure out what I would call, which we are working on, not successfully yet, but how to trade virtual water, okay? Water as embedded, or where the price is revealed through something else. So it's a question of putting a price on it, but doing it in a virtual way, as opposed to corn or wheat, you know, where it, you know, you go short on the Minneapolis Grain Exchange, you know, and maybe you're in North Dakota and you're producing spring wheat, and, you know, you ship it in, you deliver it, or you take Canadian wheat and you ship it in, or you have soft red and you ship it to Chicago, or hard red and you deliver it in Kansas. It isn't the bulk movement of physical commodities, which are equalized by transportation economics. So cost of grain in North Dakota is the cost of shipping and fobbing it and delivering it into Chicago. It's a real mathematical question. The spread gets out of line. As long as there are rail cars available or trucks, arbitrage brings it right back into line. So the knack of this invention is to do it with virtual water. That's the real, that's really the golden chalice.
My name is Grant Merritt. I've been involved in working on the environment since the 60s. And I think it's fair to point out that the reason we've got the reduction you talk about, Professor, in acid rain is due to federal legislation and the EPA and state agents and citizen action. For example, both Walter Heller and Leo Hurwitz paid attention to the political realm. I happen to know that personally. They both worked with our senators and congressmen, Don Fraser, Walter Mondale, and citizens. That really has led to what happened. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we've got a tradition here in Minnesota of setting higher standards than the federal government. It started really by both parties. It goes back to Levander and Wendell Anderson as governors. And I thought of that because of your great quote from Justice Brandeis, who talked about that very same point. So I appreciated that, and I'm glad you came up here.
Was there a question in there?
I think we've got, let's make this the last question, because I want to make my question the very last, Richard. So.
Hi, my name's Todd Guerrero. I'm a lawyer here in the Twin Cities. How do you measure success on some of the carbon exchanges, RGGI, California, and even the CCX? Because my understanding is that prices, for the most part, are down on those exchanges.
That's a complex question, but I'm going to try to do it in a nugget, okay? The efficacy of a program has to be measured, excuse me, the past efficacy, by the amount of reductions that have actually occurred. And I want to be careful to divide it into past versus futures. And if we have a bountiful crop like we do this year, 14 billion bushels of corn, records by any level, and world low prices of corn, what do consumers do? Do you think they hate it or like it? Okay, when you have a big crop of carbon, people don't like it, right? They like it with wheat, but they don't like it with... So if you cut emissions dramatically and flooded the market, that's seen as pernicious, okay? Even though you may have cut emissions by 20 or 30%. There is a second element, and this is a success and a design. You need to have the price high enough to change behavior, right? And some of the programs talk about failures like RGGI, and the EU did not adjust their targets. At SO2, they set hard ones, the government acted, and then it got out of the way. 17,000 employees at the EPA, they had 50 people in the acid rain division. You never saw the US government after the act was delayed because they read the continuous emission monitors once a year, saw if you were in compliance, and that was the end of the US government involvement. But they set hard targets at the outset. EU did not. And part of the low price, I believe, is because they did achieve reductions and found it easy picking. You know, there were paper companies that came out of Finland that were members of ours that were able to make good reductions. They did switch from coal to gas. They had meaningful things. And it worked when the price was 20 euros or 15 or 25 euros. But that's the point when the EU should have gotten together and said, listen, we made a mistake here. We got to readjust our targets. And by that time, the political will was gone. So you either have to set it legislatively and make it irrevocable and have a defining slope, and then you could do it. So a lot of the failures are based upon... RGGI, alternatively, once they saw that the price fell so low, they didn't go far enough, but they at least adjusted the targets, and it all of a sudden brought the market back to life. So the problem was not low prices per se, right? That's important to recognize. Price is a signal. It is, if you want to affect forward behavior, you have to think about the level of the cap. But sometimes low prices are very good signals. They're signals of abundance and efficacy, and you have to distinguish that. I Googled, if you go right now to the EU, the adjustment by 12, from 8 to 12, was 8%. The EU did 14%, well in excess of any reductions. And even if you normalize it over German industrial output and adjusted for the Great Crash, it's producing as much power as it did then, except the emissions are lower. But if you Google, you will find nothing, or I couldn't find, and I asked people to find nothing about the emissions reductions that have occurred in Europe. All you hear is, and write, is about low prices in Europe. That's where most of the newspapers cover. They need to say, yes, there are low prices, and yes, reductions have occurred, But we need to readjust the cap. It's always look at it, it's a failure because prices are low. We don't say that in any other commodity without putting a context. Corn prices, beef prices, pork prices, chicken prices. The only people who complain they're low are farmers. Right? So we have to distinguish between the art is to set the goal in a politically acceptable way and get that first deal right.
Awesome. Well, I think we've sort of run out of time. I was hoping to. Maybe I will ask this. I want to go back in a way to. It's related to many of the questions you've heard. To Sherman Malkerson's question, in the following sense. One of the basic insights from Ronald Coase's wonderful paper is that if property rights are allocated, then free trade among parties will lead to good outcomes. And implicit in that argument, and explicit in a couple of paragraphs, is that if property rights are not allocated properly, then you're going to get very bad outcomes, and Garrett Hardin subsequently formalized that in The Tragedy of the Commons. So one interpretation, and I think you referenced this, one of the issues in California and Arizona is that many of the farmers have rights to the water only if they use it for growing almonds or rice or alfalfa or specified crops. They do not have the right to sell it. More precisely, they're concerned that if they sell it to Los Angeles, then they'll lose their ability to reclaim it in future years. That's the nature of the problem. So my question is, how do we get that initial property rights allocation done right? Speaking for me alone, if I got a 1/10 of 1% share of the Great Lakes water being shipped to Texas, I'll take that deal. I don't particularly care for Texans, but my marginal rate of substitution between money and Texans is sufficiently high. I'll take the money instead. So my question is, how do you get the allocation of property rights right in the first place?
Two answers. Cherry, as you well know, if you get it wrong, which they did in SO2, okay, they were called bonus allowances, and the rent seekers got their teeth into it. But we do know as economists that if the initial allocation is wrong and you allow trading, you get to an efficient solution. Not necessarily an equitable one, right? But you do get to an efficient one in low transaction costs. The water issue, I think we've got to stop thinking about it as a transfer of water ownership. I think we have to redefine water in terms of leases. That's how we're approaching it. You don't buy or sell water. You get to lease it like an apartment for 1 year. So nobody ever gets deprived of their natural rights, that the ownership is only loans and rights to use it for
limited periods of time.
For limited periods of time. And that's how we are approaching it as a market, to say you can't mess around with the allocation. It's a God-given resource. We all have a fair right to it. But if I'm not using it, I can lease it to you. But I can't sell it to you. And that makes a big difference. Cherry, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You should sit. Just sit. Just sit, Richard. We'll go over there. So one of the unfortunate things about these things is that you have a limited period of time in which to have this conversation. So before we adjourn for dinner, A couple of things. One is that, again, because this is important, this conference and the reception and Richard's great presentation were not the work of Heller Hurwitz alone. Several other organizations played a central role, among them Cargill, Agribank, and the Institute on the Environment played very important roles. And in particular, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation played an absolutely central role in making all this possible. I want to recognize a number of people who are here. They serve on the advisory board of the Heller Hurwitz Economics Institute, and they're an invaluable source of advice, of support, and kindness, right, through all my many missteps. They've never said a harsh word to me, so I wanted to thank, in particular, people, but I didn't see them here, but I'll thank them, assuming that they're here. Ray Carter, Ed Foster, Zenas Hutchison, Bob Litterman, Jose Perez, Norm Rickman, who is here, Art Rolnick, Lowell Schwab, and Kurt Winkleman, who chairs our advisory board. Thank you very much, folks. And thank you to all of you for coming to the reception, and those of you who were able to attend the conference. It was just one phenomenal day, speaking for myself. It was a lot of fun, really great papers, and really first-class attendees. One last thing. Chris mentioned books that Richard has written. One of his books, most recent one, thanks to the World Scientific Publishing Company, which is the publisher of that book, they've made some copies available. There may be no free lunch, but there certainly are free copies of that book available at the reception out there. So feel free to pick that up. So having said all that, let me have Richard come up. And Richard, come on up. And this is a token of our appreciation, very, very small token of how much we love you for all that you've done for Minnesota economics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.